Hello, beautiful people. Please let me know in the comments if there are any problems with my audio. Thank you all for joining us today. We will be talking about Promethean strategies and the situation with the Three Seas Initiative, the Intermarium, and geopolitics in general relative to sea powers and heartland controlling land powers, the war in Ukraine, Poland, the United States, the European situation, and all the rest. We'll be picking up from our previous stream, Promethean Strategies Part 1. Anyone who did not see that, I would suggest that you take some time and go back and check it out, because some of the basic ideas that we'll be talking about here were laid out there. Just to summarize them briefly, the idea is that we're looking at a block that is being established between Europe proper at this point, or the Western and Central European countries, and Russia. And this block is appearing both in the sense of economic development with things like the Three Seas Initiative, but also political and military cooperation to a certain extent with the idea of intermarium and similar things coming out of the ideas of the Polish military and diplomatic guy Pilsudski, who proposed this idea of Prometheanism, which was essentially the strategy of taking countries controlled by either Russia or the Soviet Union, specifically the Soviet Union in Pilsudski's time, but basically moving them from the black column into the red column, to use an accounting metaphor, basically taking countries that in some respects were assets to Russia or the Soviet Union and turning them into liabilities. So, for example, if once upon a time Ukraine was an asset in the Russian column, by removing it from Russia and winding it up and turning it around against Russia, you move it into the column of liabilities. They lose that territory, they lose that buffer, they end up with an enemy within a relatively short march, as short as anything is in Eurasia, from the area north of the Black Sea up through to the outer limits of Moscow. The agricultural resources are then lost to Russia. The manpower that could be, rolled into their column under the Warsaw Pact and the rest would be lost to them. So that's the basic idea. But there is an additional dimension to this notion, which is that particularly as regards energy, setting up this middle ground is a way of splitting Western and Central Europe off from Russia, and particularly off from its vast mineral resources and its energy resources. So in one blow, you can weaken Russia, and you can ensure that you've got a way to apply leverage to Western Europe if they ever get out of line. For example, if they want pipelines running from Germany past the Baltic states into Russia, or out from Russia to Germany, then you can just blow them up, and there are buffer states in the way. So that's the basic background for this conversation. I'm joined again by Charlemagne, and very happy to so, as well as the Prudentialist. Pleased to have both of them on again, as well as a special guest from Central Europe. We will refer to him as Martin S. or Martin Z. A wink is as good as a nudge to a blind bat. We are very, very happy to have him on as a guest for the first time, and I expect he will be able to give us a lot of insight from a European perspective, particularly as related to nationalism and the rest, as Martin is a activist and journalist, one that is very well known. So please do follow this channel, Semigog, as well as a Safer Space. Links in the description below for ways to support this channel. I won't go into them now because I want to keep this quick and make sure that we have as much time with our guests as possible. You will see also a link for Martin's Telegram channel for Charlemagne's stuff, as well as Prudentialist. So please do support the guests. So really quickly, let's pick up from where we left off, if I can. No, that's a bit too brusque of me. Let me go ahead and just roll through everyone. Forgive me, I'm being rude. Let me just roll through and ask everyone to let us know what the latest is, or say anything by way of introduction you want to before we start, and shill anything you might need to. Let's start with you, Martin, sir. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be in this illustrious round. I really enjoyed your last conversation. It differed in a very pleasant way, in depth and in theory, from a lot of other things you hear in the right sphere about the conflict, the geopolitical conflict. And I think also you spot on with the issue of Prometheanism and the geopolitics of Poland. I think that's a very important point to stress. And I'm very happy and glad to maybe give some Central European perspective, especially about the Germanosphere, how they react and how they feel about this whole conflict evolving in Europe. So I'm very happy to be here, and I'm looking forward to an interesting discussion.
Yeah, thanks very much for coming on. And just to be sure, is there anything that you want to promote that you have up recently, or anything other than your Telegram channel, anything people should be aware of?
Since most of the things I do and publish are in German, unfortunately, yeah, it's just my Telegram channel. Sometimes there are some English conversations there, but maybe I'll publish more English content in the future.
Then Charlemagne.
Yeah, definitely check out my own Substack, which is at charlemagne.substack.com. In my sort of book review series, I am actually working on a review of C.A. Bond's book Nemesis, which is kind of hard to find these days. So I think people might be interested in that. And I'm also working on 2 articles for the Old Glory Club Substack right now. One about the recent happenings with our own Ryan Turnipseed in regards to the Lutheran Church. And then another more cultural one related to Warhammer 40k and Dungeons and Dragons. So I think those are both important articles, and so check those out when they launch in the next week or so.
Right on. Well, thanks for coming on again, Charlemagne. And Prudentialist, welcome, sir. Very happy to have you on again. What do you have to share with us, sir?
Very happy to be back. I always love a very good geopolitical discussion with some of my favorite people, as well as informed people. As for things to promote, I will just happily shill the Substack, which is theprudentialist.substack.com. Recently put out an article yesterday on the subject of discursive containment and how Twitter keeps us engaged in the spectacle of society and leaves us with little else but to enjoy that spectacle. Other than that, I will be going over George F. Kennan's History of American Diplomacy in his famous 1951 text this Saturday on Prudent Observations, which is my weekly geopolitical show, Saturdays at 2 p.m. Eastern. But very happy to be here and talking about probably one of the most important perspectives in regards to this war, because it is a part of sort of the Atlantic and mainly American strategy of how nationalism can be weaponized. And hopefully, I know we were talking before we went live about Schmidt, and I think that No Most of the Earth is very applicable in this conversation.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Thank you again for coming on. I guess just to tee up Charlemagne really quickly to remind our viewers where we kind of left off. Charlemagne had put together a fair amount of information on economic aspects that were in development under the banner of the 3 Cs initiative. And in our last stream, we didn't really have an opportunity to cover the way in which all of these things, about energy and infrastructure and the rest, really do amount to ultimately to military or national security or defense investments. And the integration of this bloc, in many respects, along the lines of economics and energy and infrastructure, amounts to a military program. Many people in the United States probably aren't aware, but the Eisenhower highway system was very much a program in order to make sure that the United States would be able to deal with circumstances associated with invasion if they needed to. At the time those roads were built, they were very much by plan and design built to carry the weight of the highway system, to carry the weight of tanks. So there was all kinds of infrastructure development to assist the U.S. in keeping its act together if it ever had to face a challenge. For example, like the one Ukraine's dealing with, where the Russians come in and they bomb power generation facilities, which cuts down on the Ukrainians' ability to transfer men and material with a railroad system that is powered primarily by electricity. There's been stories about them breaking out old steam trains. They have a certain number of diesel engines. Then you look in terms of infrastructure at the idea of things like track gauge. Trains have to, everything has to be unloaded and reloaded when you get to the edges of Western and Central Europe, where you get to track gauges associated with former Warsaw Pact countries, these kinds of things. And energy itself, the whole threat of having Russian energy cut off to Europe was, up until recently, sufficient to keep the Europeans from agitating for this kind of conflict, or at least parties among them. And now it seems as though they figure, in for a penny, in for a pound. They're in it now, so they're willing now to try to arrange for different energy and infrastructure arrangements. But in particular, we have this three Seas area. And we've talked about this before. It's this block primarily of Slavic countries, but a number that are not. Romania being notable among them, Moldova. And so this area is something that not only is being pushed as a military bloc by the West, but one that they want to accomplish some sort of economic integration with as well. And Charlemagne, I guess you have some points you wanted to make in that direction. Can you get us started along those lines?
Okay, well, the Three Seas Initiative is primarily focused on three areas of development, which is energy, transportation, and then digital infrastructure. The first two are fairly self-evident in terms of what that means. Transportation, in particular, is in large part related to railways in these areas. And then energy is in large part, or at least in some part, being done in solar investments. The energy investments being made are very clearly directed towards getting this region off of Russian oil as much as possibly can be done. But the third area of digital infrastructure is a little vague in terms of what that actually means. I found it useful, though, that Tony Blair actually used this phrase a few days ago. I think it might have been at the World Economic Forum. Either way, he sort of referenced the digital infrastructure in reference to, mandates for certain medicines, I guess we'll say. And I think from what I've been able to tell, the digital infrastructure aspect is really just about population control in this area of the world and ensuring that the general public sort of goes along with the plan that the elite are putting into place. So there's sort of like two layers. There's the energy and transportation, and then there's the controlling the people aspect. And I think that's what the digital infrastructure is mostly about, because obviously that's a really broad term. I also
one quick thing, just very broad as regards things like Elon Musk's Starlink being used as the primary communication system for the Ukrainian military. So we can't forget things like that under that rubric.
Yeah, all of this has a primarily military angle. I also looked into the funding for the Three Seas initiative a bit. Honestly, I found it virtually impossible, as is many of these bureaucracies. When you start investigating them, you can't just follow the money because it sort of changes hands and goes through so many managers. It's kind of impossible to actually tell who's even pulling strings here. That being said, if you look into the Three Seas Initiative, they have an investment fund, basically, that is contributed to by many governments and foundations. It's managed by a company called Amber Infrastructure Group, or just Amber, and they're basically they're the exclusive advisor to the fund. Basically, Amber controls the Three Seas Initiative Investment Fund, and Amber is in control of a few other funds. I forget what they are exactly, but they're not particularly relevant to this discussion. But this is a big investment management corporation that controls where billions and billions of dollars actually go. So there's sort of this financial layer between the politicians and other representatives of NGOs that speak at the Three Seas Initiative. Beneath, they're not actually controlling where the money is going directly. That would be the Amber Infrastructure Group. Looking into that company was actually pretty interesting. So currently, the fund itself is managed by a guy named Joe Phillips, who has sort of moved around a lot of these investment funds. Another one of them was called Dalmore Capital, and which is involved in a lot of projects in the UK, I noticed. These funds also tend to all invest in the same things to some extent too. I wouldn't exactly say they're in competition. It's more like they're just in sort of a managerial partnership almost. And then if you look at who actually owns Amber, I found that was really interesting as well, because Amber is actually 50% owned plus the right to appoint a majority of directors. So I guess more or less completely owned by a company called Hunt, which is actually this private Texas-based sort of mega holding group, I guess. It's sort of this Texas old money family company. Well, old money in American terms, I guess. Maybe even new money. It doesn't matter. But they actually own Amber, and they own tons of other companies as well. So I found this whole process of researching the Three Seas Initiative pretty interesting, because when you actually try to follow the money, it just sort of goes up this bureaucratic chain, and it branches off in so many different directions that it's honestly hard to even tell what's going on. But there's serious big money behind these things, including government money. I found something as well that was created recently in the U.S. called the International Development Finance Corporation, which was created in October 2018. So this is a fairly new company, or federal company, and it actually contributed a significant amount of money to this fund that is being managed by Amber. I think it was $500 million, but I would have to check. You can find, oh, it's 300 million. Okay. And you can look that up on Wikipedia. So let's see, anything else? If you look at Amber Infrastructure, actually, if you go to their website, they have a page on case studies in the actual investments they're making. One of them is called Cargo Unit, which is a railway investment. Another one's called Energy. It's like energy, but without the G. And that's like a solar energy project. So yeah, I guess that's just a quick rundown of sort of the money in Three Seas Initiative. It was actually kind of difficult to find this information. I sort of had to bypass some weird restrictions they had on their website. Not in any like nefarious way, but just like deleting HTML elements that were hiding their investments. So I thought that was pretty interesting. Yeah, I don't know. Anyone else want to say anything on that? I kind of want to publish some of this information just in like a Substack though, because it's sort of too dense to really go in a whole lot of detail about.
I'd look forward to seeing it published, Charlemagne. And but before you jump in, Prude, I just want to note, I know that Martin wants to talk about the aspect of things coming from the sea, and a couple people in the chat pointed out that Amber is probably an attempt, my background in branding here, to harken back to notions of the Amber Sea route. And of course, amber is a wealth that comes from the sea. So up there in the Baltic states, they'd walk along the beaches and gather amber. So if you think about sea powers, and a point that I think is going to be raised here shortly about that being 3 points of ingress of sea access, as well as egress for sea access. The name Amber becomes rather interesting in and of itself. Generally, in their branding, they will tell you things about themselves that are often sort of unintentional. But sorry, Prude.
I was just going to add on a little bit of the history of the financial aspect from the U.S. government that Charlemagne had listed, along with some of the other partners that are investing in the Three Seas Initiative Fund, which I believe is based out of Luxembourg, based on its SICAV-AIR. It's their sort of legal way to delineate what kind of holdings company it is. But the United States' International Development Finance Corporation, the DFC, is a sort of bureaucratic streamlining, which we almost never hear about in the United States, but it came out of the Trump administration in the USA Build Act, and it merged the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, which was started by President Nixon, as well as the Development Credit Authority of USAID. So this had been a way to streamline, but also see as a way to compete against the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. That way it would be easier for the United States to fund infrastructure projects abroad. And the 3Cs initiative is one of them with its $300 million investment. But if you were to go to the 3Cs Initiative Fund and some of their core sponsors of this fund, you are going to see Exim Bank out of Romania, Altum, the Estonian Ministry of Finance, the Slovene banking strategy, Exim, the Bulgarian Development Bank, and the National Promotion Institution, the MPI, which provides loans, guarantees repayable investments, and their activities are financed by European Union grants for economic development. So you're seeing a rather strong Western European as well as American focus on there, with its boards, both a management and supervisory, primarily being Eastern European, with Poland, Lithuania, and Bulgaria, and Estonia, Slovenia. I mean, pretty much what we would consider Central or Eastern European states being the primary individuals who sit on this board, but most, if not all of this money is coming from Western grants, specifically from the EU and the United States.
Interesting. Yes. Well, Charlemagne, did you have anything to add, or shall we turn to Martin?
Real quick, the supervisory board of this investment fund, it's actually chaired by a Polish representative, which is interesting, as well as the management board. So Poland has a very large role in managing this fund. And Exim Bank was also a notable donor from Romania that I actually found as well in my own research, which Prudentialist had mentioned there. Let's move on to Martin. I will post some links in chat and stuff while we're talking as well.
Sounds good. Thanks, Charlemagne. Martin?
Yeah, thank you very much for doing all this research. I think it's also not a big surprise that this initiative is financed by Western money, also American money. The conversation we had before also mentioned that there are also American geopolitical experts touring exactly those countries, promising them that they will become the next industrial powerhouse, not only of Europe, but of the whole world. And I also know for a fact from a lot of contacts that I have that a lot of people see Poland as a new industrial center in Europe, especially because of the security guarantee it has now. After the blowing up of Nord Stream 1 and 2, who in his right mind would invest money into German industry if he had a lot of money to invest? So there's a security guarantee for Poland. Which is also very interesting is if you look at the countries in the European Union, and you can see it on this graphic, who are net contributors from the contributions to the European Union, is exactly those countries, especially France and Germany, who are losing power now and will basically see the whole project of a strategic autonomy crumble. And those countries who are receiving the funds are also the countries who will form this 3Cs initiative, and Poland is on the top of them. So it's very funny and macabre in a way that the countries like Germany and France are even paying for a geopolitical project and prepping those countries up financially, who will basically take away their freedom, their autonomy, and also their wealth in the long run. And what I can see now... Sorry?
Just a very quick question, because you know much more about this. Are the things that we're hearing about how the loss of this energy through Nord Stream 1 and the contemplated coming energy that would have come through 2 when activated, is all of that really destroying Germany's domestic industrial production? Is it having as much of an effect on that as we're hearing in the West?
Yes, it is. So it doesn't break down overnight, obviously, but we see a flight of capital to American state bonds, to the dollar, We see also a flight of intellectual resources. Like, this is all anecdotal evidence, but you can also back it up with the numbers. People I know who are in Mint and university and are looking for jobs. It's very hard to get a job now in Europe, but especially in the Germanosphere. It's very easy to get one in America. There are a lot of welcome programs. There's a program from the United States of America to basically transfer the whole chemical industry from Germany over to America and over to the States. An acquaintance of mine, he works as an industrial architect, and he told me most of the projects they have to build plants and enterprises in Central Europe, especially Western Europe and Germany, are stalled and frozen now, and they now get contracts as European, in spite of them working with the metric system, for huge new American and Canadian reindustrialization projects. So that's definitely something that's going on. And also with blowing up Nord Stream 1 and 2, Germany becomes totally dependent on Poland. And will have basically, Poland will have the trigger to cut Germany completely off from the last Russian energy pipelines. It's also very interesting. Even in the Soviet Union, the German, the communist part of Germany tried to circumvene Poland in a way, because even within the Soviet Union, there was an issue between Eastern Germany and Poland, and it was always the project of Eastern Germany and now the German Republic to circumvene Poland. And now with blowing up this pipeline, Germany is totally in the hands of Poland when it comes to its energy autonomy and the energy it can get from Russia.
Yet that seems as though it underscores the importance of the Danube as well, which I've talked about before, because most Americans don't know. Certainly Europeans will. Certainly you do, Martin. But the Danube is an enormously important river, and with the canal locks up around, I think it's Mainz, they connect to the Rhine, if I remember right, and go all the way to the North Sea. And so part of this game in terms of access for shipping of things. You could put small tankers on the Danube and carry LNG or Russian energy up through countries like Serbia and Hungary if the Danube were open. But of course, Serbia has been blocked off now, including from the Adriatic now, with Montenegro coming under Western control. And the last little tenuous hold that Russia has there is Transnistria with the Dniester, which would then put them up closer to these other countries like Moldova, that's a riparian state on the Danube. But go on, sorry.
No, I absolutely agree. The strategic and economic importance of rivers can never be understated. That's absolutely true. But I just wanted to take up this point. It's really a big problem, a stress test for the German economy right now. And a lot of people, experts, see the German industrial capacity fleeing first to Poland, because obviously labor costs are cheaper there. On the day that the Nord Stream pipelines were blown up, the Baltic pipes to Poland were open up. So Poland is already has been investing in LNG technology early on. Maybe they were tipped off about what's going to happen in Europe. So if you want to have a protected area to have your enterprise, your industry there, it's first Poland, and then later on probably America and Canada, where you have an area which cannot be disrupted in any way. But the whole breakdown and the stagflation and the new Weimar scenario did not take place yet in Germany. But what we definitely see is an increase in living costs, which is very hefty, especially for poor people. And we also see an increase for all right-wing populist parties in Austria and in Germany, I would say, as a direct reaction to that. And obviously Nord Stream is very politicized. There were a lot of demonstrations there, the AfD, but also very left-wing parties, remnants of the Eastern German Communist Party, were rallying to open the pipelines, and the whole energy issue, the sanctions, is a very big political topic in the Germanosphere in Austria and Germany.
Yes, that's Yes, it does seem that this has been going on for quite some time, as you say, with countries being tipped off beforehand, and it seems very likely that mm, well before this has all been in planning since well before the Maidan stuff. With the South Ossetia and Georgia, again, Georgia being a primary Prometheanism target country, I think we saw the first major move in this strategy. Then Russia pushed back on that, and they moved for the Maidan stuff. And it certainly seems that there's been a plan to hammer on Germany for quite some time as well. Well, I'm sorry though. What would you like to discuss next?
Just one thing I wanted to add, sorry, but then because this might be interesting, there's this conspiracy theory that the energy dependence from Germany to Russia was a plan both by socialist and by conservative politicians to, in a way, get out of American control. Because with the energy dependence on Russia, they could argue to the overlords in America that they have, in a way, to be diplomatic to Russia because they are depending so much on Russia. So this economic integration of Germany and Russia pushed for by especially social democratic politicians like Schröder. Some people see it as a first geopolitical attempt of Germany to first to get out of in a way of American control. So to put themselves willfully into the dependency of a different geopolitical force, so they could start to have this neutral position between America, the United States, and Russia.
Yeah, and if I remember correctly, there was a move, and I cannot remember the details, so forgive me if I'm getting it wrong, but roughly somewhere between 2008 and 2010, I remember that there was a move by Europeans to at least to consider a petro-euro, and that they were going to partner in some respects with Iran for that. I never saw many people talking about it, but there was a whole period where Iran was, in theory, going to be the new energy solution in some respect, or one of them, I should say, because the energy needs are so vast. But one of the answers to energy needs for Europe was supposed to be Iran, and there was talk of a petro-euro. And then I remember, because I was working in Europe at the time and got paid in euro, and right at the moment that my employer decided to finally disperse the funds and pay me in euros, they had waited until the euro reached its lowest point ever. I believe that was in 2010. So basically, there was talk of a petro-euro and all the rest around that time, and then the euro got hammered hard, and all of the pressure on Iran got increased. So that might have been a period where factions within the EU were trying to push to break out, as you say, from the close control of Atlanticist powers, and they got hammered hard for it. A similar thing happened, if I'm remembering correctly, in the 1970s when the Italians wanted to set up their own refinery facilities. And shortly after they announced they were going to try to do that, their economy got hammered and went in, down the drain. So I guess that brings me to one quick question. Maybe Martin, you can answer this in some respect. Do you think it's possible that if there were factions within Germany that were trying to break out of this, that they would have at one time seen the EU as the best vehicle for this? I hear a lot of people talking about, how the EU is basically just a mechanism by which Atlanticist powers control Europe. And I wonder if that's entirely true, because in any of these organizations, you'd have to see factions. So from one perspective, an Atlanticist perspective, you could say that the EU is a vehicle to make further control or indirect management of Europe possible for NATO, for the United States, and the rest. From another perspective, you could say that perhaps factions in Germany saw it as a way to break out through this vehicle. Do you think there's anything to that, or is that too far out?
I think it's very complicated because Germany doesn't really have a geopolitical strategy. It's basically, I call it an export eunuch, so a castrated country that basically is putting all this energy into economy, a bit like Japan maybe, but even in a worse extent. I think the European Union maybe could be a way for a European strategic autonomy, but at the moment only under the leadership of France, which obviously also Germany doesn't want, because it also would mean an economic domination of France. So I think the European Union has this problem that if you want to have a united Europe, it mostly in history only worked under one nation leading it, whether it was France under Napoleon or Germany, and also in the Holy Roman Empire. I think it could be like that, but it would have to be structured completely differently. At the moment, I would say the European Union serves this purpose. You all know the slogan: to keep the Russians out and the Germans down, and the transatlanticists in. So that's how I would see it. But with this whole Iranian petro-euro, but also the German pipeline, the Nord Stream, I think all of this is a very important history lesson to Germany and to many other countries. If you want to have an economic independency and autonomy, you need to have a military autonomy first. So I think it's a very hard lessons the Germans are learning right now. Politics isn't over. Geopolitics does exist. And if you're basically a colony, a military colony of the United States, on the long run, you cannot pursue an economic and ecological policy that the Americans don't want. And the Germans thought they could have it both. They could basically be under the American rocket umbrella and be in this post-political, pacifistic end of history, but at the same time have energy policy that's independent and that's autonomous and that goes in a way the Americans don't like. And I think it's a very brutal wake-up call to the geopolitical reality, and I hope that Germany will learn from that.
Well, yes, yeah, it's the most painful lessons that generally make an impression, right, and stay in your memory. Yeah, and this it has to be a very, very painful lesson for people across Europe, not least in Poland, Germany, Ukraine, obviously, Moldova. All these countries are screwed right now because of these adjustments that are being made, or at least, non-elite segments of the population. Well, I wonder then if it seems appropriate at this point, Martin, to jump to the broader topic of sea powers. I know that you wanted to cover that, unless there's anything, Charlemagne or Prudentialist, that you guys wanted to plug in at this point, or anything else, Martin, that you thought should come first.
Definitely for me. So yeah, the focus on Germany here is useful because if you remember a couple of years ago, and this is still said sometimes, people would talk about, especially the British, would talk about the European Union as this German phenomenon, like it was an expansion of Germany, basically. But even if that was true at some time, it's clearly not true anymore, because Germany has been regarded as a sort of economic leader in Europe anymore, and certainly not of the European Union. And I kind of think that this rhetoric is sort of encouraged, actually, because rhetoric around the European Union distracts from what the Atlanticists are doing with Poland. And we sort of had this mimetic idea of Germany being this sort of industrial heartland of Europe, even though that's all basically been moved to Poland at this point, or not all of it, but it's more than 50%. I mean, Germany's just gutted at this point, and Poland is now going to become the centerpiece for American power within Europe, and Germany's just going to be left out to dry. And speaking of harsh lessons, I mean, Germany just kind of got humiliated in the last few days. Maybe, I'm not sure if the Americans quite understand this, but it's pretty clear that the propaganda that was done to the Germans over the last 80 years has actually worked really, really well, and they're very much a pacifist country at this point, and the Americans basically just forced them to send their tanks to the Ukraine, which is something they very much clearly did not want to do. But I feel it's a little too late for Germany to do much in this circumstance unless something really extraordinary happens. So there was something else I wanted to add. Oh yeah, there was this article I noticed as well from the Brookings Institute that I posted in chat. I mean, I think it's been pretty clear that Atlanticist policy for a very long time has been to prevent any sort of rapprochement between Germany and Russia, or Germany and the Soviet Union. And anytime they start getting too cozy with each other, something happens to split them apart, as we saw with the Nord Stream attack. This article I posted was sort of observing the quote-unquote problem of Germany's coupling to Russia in June of last year. And of course, we know the Nord Stream attack happened not so long after that. So, they talk about the dependence on Russia as sort of a security issue for Germany, even though it's really quite the opposite, because that dependency on Russia could alternatively be looked at as a liberation from the Atlanticists. But of course, Germany apparently just has no more political power because it's completely gutted its military and its economy, and they have just no bargaining chips left on the table at all. So it's a very unfortunate situation. I think we're only going to see this increase. Perhaps the Germanosphere, which is an interesting word that I haven't heard before, could actually be the appropriate counterweight to the shenanigans happening with the Three Seas Initiative, because the whole thing is designed around just utterly smashing any German potential on the continent, at least for the next 100 years. So maybe if Germans actually catch on to what's up and manage to break away from the U.S., there could be sort of some hope to thwarting what's happening right now. So that's all I'll add there.
Yeah, I'm seeing guys in the chat saying, how terrible Russia is. I'm not here, and I'm not aware of any of our guests here endorsing Russia or taking a pro-Russian position. And I do have direct experience of Russia. I've been there. So yeah, sorry, man. In terms of the stuff of,
Yeah, let me just add, since you mentioned Russia, just in terms of Russia, I think all of this is driven at shattering the Russian Federation into smaller separate states. It's not really the best paradigm to sort of take half measures in this sort of thing. So I don't think that this is merely some sort of competitor with Russia or designed just to cut Russia off and then leave it there. I think the end game here is to finish off the Cold War, basically, and to actually dissolve the Russian state. But maybe others don't. Maybe that's a little too far for some others, but that's just my perspective.
I think you definitely see, what's that old thing from Dune, plans within plans. The nature of the Atlanticist project, or a seaborne power project, is to apply this pressure broadly and all over the place, and to create from a series of seemingly disconnected movements a whole sort of integrated orchestra, if you like, that creates a whole greater than the sum of its parts. So you have to look for the little pieces. You have to look for the strange signs. Like, you remember when Trump went to shortly after being elected, went to Europe, and there's that photograph of him sitting at the table while Merkel and these other people are all standing up in front of him, and he was basically like, "You need to start paying for your own protection." And Germany was like, "What are you talking about? No." And Trump warned about the gas and stuff. And now you can see that Germany apparently has been quite literally punished for their intransigence, and it wouldn't make sense unless you put the various pieces together from our current perspective. Likewise, I remember when the most recent talk about Polish reparations from Germany appeared within the last few years. I don't know, within the last 5, certainly. There's a new talk about how Germany should pay, and it appears now in hindsight that this was just another one of these moves to signal to them that the pressure was going to be put on them, that the usual levers were going to be pulled. And yet factions there in Germany continued not to listen, apparently, because now their pipelines have been blown up. They're being deindustrialized, and they're being publicly humiliated internationally. And the last piece I'd say is it's possible, yes, that they want to break up Russia if they can get it, but they usually have a plan B and a plan C. People talk about, I know no one here thinks this, but people talk about how, if Russia wins in the Ukraine, then it's a total loss for the West. No, it's not. We've covered that. It recreates the boogeyman of Russia. It justifies further NATO alliance and funding of defensive stuff. It absolutely blows military production and industrialization outside of Germany, and in places like the United States, it blows it through the roof all of these arsenals that are being emptied of old Warsaw Pact gear have to be replaced with nice new weapons. And likewise, even if they can't split Russia up, which again is my sort of central point, they can push it into the arms of China. And you might think that that is a terrible thing for the United States. But I'm not so sure that in the long game that's the case, because now you have Russia and China increasingly dependent upon each other. And if some lever gets pulled that ends up putting them at odds, which is not impossible to imagine, then they've got a real problem, because you've got two hegemons within the same critical territory. Anyway, just a few things to throw out there. Prudentialist, did you have anything to add, or should we go straight to Martin?
The one thing that I did want to add in regards to what Charlemagne had mentioned with the tanks is that President Duda of Poland had made that announcement to transfer these tanks and sort of force Germany's hand on this, had came just a few days ago, earlier this month, in regards to the Lublin Triangle, which is another organization and sort of cooperation between the countries of Lithuania, Poland, and Ukraine. And it's sort of to bring a deliberate reference to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth with the Union of Lublin in 1569, which had, triggered a large part of the views in regards to the differences between, say, the relationship of Russia to Poland, not to mention sort of the beginnings of moving from, Eastern Orthodoxy to Eastern Catholicism and sort of a lot of the Union movements. But this organization was started in the 28th of July in 2020, and this was the joint declaration of restoring Ukrainian territorial integrity, to end Russian aggression against Ukraine, and supporting NATO accession for Ukraine, and considering a membership action plan for these countries. They had also put a significant pressure on Belarus to join this organization, which creates its own tenuous issues because of Belarus's relationship with Russia, at least with the current leadership. And in their most recent meeting, which happened on the 11th, is when they announced their meetings here. But this is just another organization that has received an endorsement from the United States State Department saying that this is a good thing and looking forward to open cooperation, and has received significant dialogue with the European Union in the past. And these things are important for us to keep in mind, because this is another avenue or an alternative strategy in case, say, 3Cs doesn't work out, or it's another thing to levy influence on. And this is just one of, several aspects of how history and national identity can potentially be used and weaponized through historical ethnic grievances, and how Western powers might be able to take advantage of that.
Yeah, just one final note on that grievance. I mean, basically what's happening is Poland is enjoying the ability to just push around Germany in a most humiliating manner with the full muscle of the US behind it. And they're totally happy with that bargain.
Exactly. I think on the long run, this was never so good for Poland to do that. I thought it was very interesting, the historic fiction of Charlemagne in the last video, where he saw Poland leading a peacekeeping mission to gather the Russian nukes after the disintegration of the Russian Empire. There are a lot of theories that Poland also wants to prolong the war as long as possible, because a weakened, destroyed Ukraine would then be for Poland to secure, where Poland also could take back some of the lost territory in Western Ukraine. But when it comes to Russia and China, I'm more a fan of the theory that this thing was a warning shot of the global order to China, to show them what would happen if they would maybe think about a military action in Taiwan. And if you look at what they did, and nobody expected that, the weaponization of the money reserve system, the weaponization of maritime insurances, crazy. I think China, if this would happen against China, which is way, way, way less autark in a way, and autonomous in terms of energy and resources than Russia, it would have really, really bad effects on China, way worse effects on China. China is bigger than Russia, yeah. Economically, it's bigger, but I think China is way more dependent on the world market, on open seas, and especially on oil imports from the Gulf, which could be easily disrupted. So I think that this is more a warning shot against China. And when it comes, I think it's a very important question, like, are we pro-Russia because we criticize America's policy in Central Europe? No, not at all. I think it's you can talk about Russia and about this invasion, and I think it's also very important to understand that these countries from the Three Seas Initiative, they are not just puns of America. They don't lack agency. And if you look at the history, being brutalized between three empires, the German, the Russian, and the Balkan Empire for hundreds of years, it's very obvious that they would develop a theory like Prometheanism and anti-imperialism, and this dream of like a European of small nations. But where, for me, the red line is drawn is, and I'll bring up Schmidt, and maybe the potentialist can continue with that, is the ban on intervention for spatially foreign powers. And that's the problem. That's the issue. And if it was China putting millions into Hungary and stirring up a conflict and war somewhere in Europe and supporting Hungary against Ukraine, for example, then I would be very critical of that, because a foreign power, not because it's evil, but because it's foreign and far away, cannot have the same interest as we Europeans. And Russia and Ukraine, they are not spatially foreign. They are, in a way, European powers. We'll never get rid of them, and they will never get rid of us. We have to find a way, a balance. But for America, they don't care if Europe breaks down, because they're just so far away. So I think whether side you're on, as a European, you should be for a ban on intervention for spatially foreign powers. And I think we can all agree that America, for Europe, is a spatially foreign power.
No argument here. Yeah. Guys, any thoughts?
Yeah. At the beginning of what you were saying there, you mentioned how it's a bad bargain for Poland, and it's bad because this bargain with the U.S., we know how it works out. Poland can become this sort of dominant, even imperial power in Europe or Eastern Europe, but the cost, no matter how much Poles might enjoy, punishing their historical enemies, the cost is a total destruction or Americanization of your culture. So there'll be a big Polish empire, maybe, but there won't be a Polish nation anymore. So all Europeans need to keep that in mind in regards to these partnerships with the United States, that unfortunately all of these countries still seem more than happy to do, out of this sort of fear of Russia, which, I understand the historical issues there, but I think military fears of Russia are pretty unfounded at this point. I mean, we mentioned like the case where Russia wins the war, right? I mean, if Russia wins this war, it doesn't restore the Russian Empire. It just gets them barely a toehold still to hang on to. That's the situation they're in, right? Whereas if they lose it, it could be, it could be the real end. But if they win, it's not like this is going to be some huge threat to the stability of the borders of Europe, especially with the Polish army sitting there. So,
yeah, I would add, I don't see any kind of Polish Empire or anything like that. I see,
probably an exaggeration. I mean that in terms of I mean that in like economic terms. Like Poland would be at the head of this huge economic bloc built up in Europe. Not that their borders would necessarily encompass like vastly more territory or something like that, but an empire like the Gay is now.
Right. I would see them as basically being a sock puppet with somebody's hand up their ass. And likewise, they're going to end up enjoying being something like the old Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, with all these different populations basically pushed up into Poland. The sheer number of Ukrainians that are in the country now is staggering. So, they're going to get to...
The results of these economic blocks, like I said, is the disintegration of your culture. And one of the ways that happens is through all of these people moving about in these economic integrations.
True. I think it's very important to stress that now we read really every day in German and Austrian newspapers that the next target for Russia will be Berlin, and Ukraine is basically the only thing standing between us and the Russian tanks. And I mean, it's so crazy. Russia had no military geopolitical interest in a westward expansion. They never had in their history. And if you look at where Russia was involved in Central Asia, in Syria, obviously what they wanted with Western Europe is economic influence, but basically a safe backyard. And I think it's very important That's at least my understanding. If you look what happened in Syria, you look at Gaddafi, you look at Saddam Hussein, and Syria is the first country where the United States wanted a regime change. They didn't want to talk. They still don't want to talk to Assad and their whole family there. But it didn't work. And it didn't work because of Russia intervention. It was the first time after the fall of the Soviet Union that Russia became a player again and was free to roam with the troops on the global stage. And now, after Ukraine, that's gone and will never come back. It will be a bleeding wound in the East. Will I think our lifetimes create a new a Cold War or an Iron Curtain in a way, an economic Iron Curtain at least. And Russia's troops and Russia's military focus will be left in the Ukraine. I think after a certain point, Americans think, okay, that was enough. Now Russia has bled enough. I think the Americans will not push the dagger into the heart of Russia because they would create a mess. You mentioned the thing with the nukes there, and America doesn't want to go nuke hunting in Russia. They have the other way more important strategic interest. And I think after a while, they just pivot away and leave Europe, Russia, Ukraine with the whole mess, with the rise of petty nationalism, revanchism, and Russia will be hemmed in again. And I think they also have learned the lesson that they should not intervene into American geopolitical operations in the Middle East.
One of the objections you tend to see to these things too is how nationalisms are abused by the United States, which is a point we brought up in the last stream. I mean, you'll see Poles or any Europeans be like, well, we can make this devil's bargain with the United States because, we're Poles and our nationalism is so strong and our identity is so strong that we won't succumb like literally every single other country has to Americanization because we're Poles and we're special. And, excuse me for doubting that given what has happened in the 20th, 21st century at America's economic imperial hand.
Agree.
Prude, Martin, either of you?
The one thing I would add is that you mentioned plans upon plans, as well as what Martin had mentioned about perhaps a potential pivot. And one of the things that I have stressed in our last discussion, but I have also stressed in numerous other places, is that it is really important for you to read sort of what the non-governmental organization, NGO, think tank arm of sort of the American policymaking part of it writes, because that does give you a pretty good idea of where things might go. And so the Rand Corporation, rather infamous for their writings of white papers and research on how to conduct policy or what we might want to do and with regards to Russia or China, Taiwan, etc., they've written just about anything on everything. And their most recent one from January of this year was U.S. policy and trajectory towards the Ukraine conflict. And in their perspective, they want to explore the concerns of how we can prevent a long protracted conflict, because that only increases the risk of escalation and the usage of nuclear weapons or potentially getting NATO in control. And so they're looking towards ways to get out of this, not to mention that the United States is still focused heavily on a pivot towards the Indo-Pacific region. We've recently, I discussed last week, the ongoing political gambit that the United States is supporting Prime Minister Fumio Kishida's proposals on increasing the military budget and standing forces of the Japanese self-defense forces and potentially being a much more offensive structure, and reliance on their partnerships and containment towards China and what they can do to increase access to semiconductor production, which is a huge aspect towards any advanced technological military, especially for the United States or anyone that wants to use. For instance, Mitsubishi had created lithium-ion batteries to help power submarines for the Japanese self-defense forces. You need semiconductors and advanced materials for that. And one of the things that connects these two vastly different areas of geography together is that two companies in Ukraine produce 60% of the world's semiconductor-grade neon, and those companies have been shut down since the start of the war almost a year ago next month, which has put a significant hamper on supply chains and forced a lot of reindustrialization and investment towards the West in general, specifically the United States. And those things do play a role in regards to this conflict as well. And I think that we can't, while our eyes do get focused on the maps and the battle lines that may happen inside Ukraine, these things also affect things globally. And I mean, that's going to be a big aspect of this, is that as Martin had referred to earlier with Schmidt, is that, we're looking at the world in terms of resources and how that's going to be allocated and divided. And we're watching sort of the reterritorialization, as Schmidt sort of kinds of alludes to in Nomos of the Earth, even before Deleuze and Guattari coined that term, that we're now seeing how resources are going to be allocated by a spatial power that can not only work land, air, and sea, but also economically, culturally, and through its cultural exports, its Americanization. And I think that that's something that we're going to see in the future in this region.
Maybe you can put in the screen again. I think it's a very interesting summary. Here you can see where Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine are first, second, and third in global ranking together as an area. And you can see where supply chains will be hit. And you mentioned neon, obviously a big issue. I mean, you can produce it, so it's not like a resource you get out of the ground, but that's still a big hit. And I agree with you. I think America will pivot to someplace else. I have two questions, and like you're very informed round. I would be very interested how you see it. And the first is more kind of a micro question. How do you see the Ukrainian war developing? I read the last Substack of Charlemagne about it. It was very interesting. And the second would be, because I think like there's a lot of, I would say, like amicable naivety on the part of people who have dissenting views on the war, and they think now we enter the stage of multipolarity. The BRICS countries will basically like get rid of the Bretton Woods system. And then there are other voices who say, no, we are actually entering a deglobalized world with the American century, where America, as the last superpower with dollar diplomacy, completely will dominate a more and more chaotic world. So maybe you hear, like, which is more my side, but I would really like to hear what's your position on the micro level. Like, how do you think the Ukrainian war will turn out? How long will it last? And who will be the victor, if you can say so? And on a macro level, how do you think this war will change the world? And do you think we are reaching multipolarity, or do you think it will America will come out even stronger of this problem and of these events?
My take on it, quickly, for the macro thing, is the same one it's always been. Nothing is certain, can't be sure. But I think that the greatest likelihood is that Russia will be able to claim victory conditions having been met in some sense. If they have to stretch it here or shoehorn it there, I think it's more likely that Russia will be able to claim victory, but that's absolutely not certain. And in terms of what's going on the ground, I wouldn't want to go into any more detail than that, just because there's some they're going after Ugledar, or they just took Soledar and are moving further west. For the macro picture, my pet theory at present, and it's all just speculation, but it's basically that there are real issues in terms of needing to have some correspondence between production, industrial production, national security, meaning secrecy regarding military technology. Basically, to have a territorial unit that is producing and is able to produce for itself in the case of military conflict, meaning that you cannot distribute global supply chains everywhere if what you're talking about is producing equipment that's absolutely critical to wage war. Because all of this globalist nonsense has been made possible by the fact that there has been one power that can act as a kind of global policeman. As soon as there is not one uncontested global power, then it becomes important again to consider the possibility that competitors can outdo you in industrial production or in military technology, at which point you have to be able to produce a certain amount of things yourself. Now, when I say yourself, in quotes, that doesn't necessarily mean a nation state. It can be a bloc, right? Or it can be NATO along with the Atlanticists, right? Or it can be Russia cooperating with certain partners in the CIS, or even to a limited extent, like the BrahMos missile program with India or with China. So basically what I'm saying is the service economy people who are proponents of deindustrialization and all the rest, the world that they've had in their mind has been premised on this idea of having one a dominant global power, what's been called the unipolar world. But as soon as a country really pushes back meaningfully and says no in the real sense, then it becomes necessary to consider the military conflict, the industrial production, the security surrounding these processes, including supply chain security for, steel or whatever it is you need for your military manufacture. At that point, suddenly the whole dream of a service-based economy West falls to pieces because they suddenly discover that they need to be able to produce 100,000 155 millimeter shells per month or whatever, So to me, it looks like some of that is happening. And I often wonder whether or not specifically a group of people, of powers, of elites who have historically been tied to manufacturing. I'm not saying like the Krupps family or something, but like, one of these famous old families that has been tied to military and defense contracts as well as to industrial power. Those are the guys that were being kicked out the door by what has been happening with the deindustrialization in the West of the West, and the outsourcing of production to countries far, far away. It seems to me that one of the best ways, if they wanted to bring that industrial production online, in the sense that I was just talking about, where it would have to groupings would have to form that defended their own production capacity and their own military secrets. All they would have to do, those old powers, would be to start a war. And suddenly you would see the kind of nonsense that it appears that we're seeing in Europe or in the Biden administration, where they're like, wow, this didn't work out immediately like we thought. And now we have to go looking for weapon and equipment in all these far-flung countries because we don't have the industrial capacity. And slowly it's beginning to dawn on them that they have to return that domestic production. So I often wonder whether or not we're just looking at what a lot of people are calling, Cold War III, where we're going to see, Cold War II, where we're going to see a division into distinct cooperating military industrial blocks. Simply because it doesn't make any sense for the United States to be reliant militarily upon a country that, for example, might end up being its enemy in the future, like Trump with tariffs and shifting some production back to the United States as regards steel. So in the short term, I think with Ukraine, it's still most likely that Russia will be able to claim victory there, though that's by no means certain. And then in terms of the bigger picture, I think we're looking at a Cold War II for the reasons that I tried to, however ramblingly tried to underline there.
Yeah, I would say I think it's much more likely that the United States gets a second wind and becomes an even more powerful unipolar point in the world this century than the opposite happening, simply because so many things are going to have to go right for any competitors in order to achieve true multipolarity. Even if the Russians and the Chinese achieved a serious rapprochement with each other, they still combined don't have the military capacity to challenge the United States. And of course, this matters because it's not about having like nuclear weapons pointed at each other or something, although that matters too. But it's more about to what degree can you fight and win these wars in other regions, in proxy wars against one another, right? In regions that are of strategic importance, like Ukraine for the neon production, for example. This is useful that I heard about this. I only heard about this a few days ago, but there was a shortage in Raspberry Pis, which are a sort of microcomputer. They're like these really cool programmable like $50 or $10 computers even that you can buy and just hook up to your TV or whatever. And there was a shortage in those. And based on what they posted on their website, I mean, it's clearly related to not just the general supply chain issues, but the issue with chip manufacturing right now in general. I think we're starting to see impacts happen, and obviously chip manufacturing is critical. So if the United States is capable, and we'll see what happens, if the United States is capable of prosecuting these long-term proxy wars for the rights to certain territory, basically to be within their geopolitical sphere, that's going to outweigh whatever any other competitor bloc can try to stand up to form a more multipolar world. Which, again, like so far, China's playing it really cool, it seems, in terms of the current war going on. Maybe they got the message about Taiwan. I mean, there's other issues too that are really problematic for any competitors to the United States. Like Turkey, I think, is a big one. Turkey's in NATO, but it sort of plays both sides, and they're clearly sort of, trying to decide whether they're going to go east or west, or just continue sort of straddling the line based on how this war goes. And this war is just one small step in a direction for a multipolar world. And although I think Russia, like you said, is more likely to be able to claim some sort of victory, I mean, I think the odds are greatly in favor of the United States just through sheer momentum and the overwhelming richness of the United States. But our elites seem to be deteriorating, and they seem to have been overconfident in their ability to sort of sweep Russia out of Ukraine, and maybe that could change things. Like you said, it's just all too uncertain, but I think just baseline, it's far more likely for the U.S. to become an even stronger unipolar power this century than any other alternative. As much as I would like to see a multipolar world, because I think it would produce a more peaceful world.
Who's next?
Well, I think we should get into the Atlanticist stuff more now, since we're.
You don't need to answer. Like I don't demand an answer from all of you. I just thought it would be interesting what you think about it, and I mostly have to say I agree. I think especially important was what Semigog said, that the whole globalism was not like an economic spillover effect or an enlightenment of human beings, that they see that economy is just like better than war, but it was an order developed under the shadow of America as a world police. So I think that's I would absolutely agree with that.
And Prude, did you have anything? I don't know if Prude is. You're here.
No, I'm back. Just not at this moment. No.
Okay. Well, what should we cover then next? Did you actually cover the Atlanticist stuff you wanted to mention and sea power things, Martin, or is that something still outstanding?
No, definitely we can talk about it. I think it's a very important issue, because that's the world we're living in. That's the geopolitical reality. It's a unipolar world. After the Soviet Union crumbled, the biggest, I would say, connected sphere of political, military, and economical influence that was not controlled in a way or hemmed in by the United States, and could lead, in a way, proxy wars with them, from Vietnam to Afghanistan, was gone. And after that, I would say America is the unipolar world power, but I think it's a very special one, and I think it's very important to understand it as a naval and maritime power that wants a free flow of goods, of information, of intelligence, of people, like mobilization of all the people, and to create kind of a liquid society of anywhere. So I think that's also kind of the metaphysical long-term goal of America as a geopolitical force. And I think that's the geopolitical reality we're in, whether we like it or not. And I think there's the theories of Carl Schmitt, but also of Oswald Spengler, a lot of German new right thinkers, that all of this comes from the Navy, comes from the mindset of the trader that goes from the Americans to UK to some even point out to the Phoenicians, who are the sea power fighting against Rome. I think that's a very interesting theory. I think it's some people overuse it a bit. I don't think it can explain anything, but I think it can explain a lot, and it also puts in perspective the whole conflict, I would say, in America between Trump and between the flyover states who represent a more continental land power version of America, the Americana vision, against the coastal areas in America who are also more prone to this sea power universalistic mission. That's just maybe a starting point. Let's see what you think about this theory and thesis.
Well, I certainly like the idea of extending it to the U.S., which I hadn't thought about before. That makes perfect sense. I mean, we talk about coastal elites and everything, and certainly I know about the idea of the land powers and sea powers, as you say, from Phoenicians and Rome, which had to develop a navy at that point. It hadn't focused on it as much prior to that. Obviously, the Greeks did, but then with Thucydides, you've got the whole business of the Spartans versus the Athenians, where we see that same model play out. And as you say, we've got it with sea powers like the English, like the French, certainly like the Americans, the Dutch as well, very much so. And a lot of people forget it, but the other group that makes really great ships are the Germans. The Germans would not have been. The only reasons the Germans didn't play a larger role in this game is because the Brits decided to try to keep them bottled up in the North Sea. Russians actually make fairly good ships. Yeah, Europeans in general really do well with ships and seaborne trade. The Portuguese, obviously, Italians, the first explorers being, like Genoese, like Columbus, going through Portuguese and Spanish courts to fund their voyages down the coasts of Africa in the 15th century. So I'd be hesitant to associate it strictly with the English. In terms of that predisposition on the part of Europeans. But I certainly wouldn't argue with your main point, which is that we see the power structure now with the Atlanticists. And we see that with the U.S. being world police and the Brits apparently being willing to ride shotgun with them. And for all the talk of blue water navies with the Indians, and the Japanese expanding, and obviously the Chinese expanding enormously, we still seem to be in a dominant position there. We'll see how it all goes with hypersonic missiles, but I feel sure that Prude has something to say here in this respect.
I've been thinking about this a lot, and I kind of think back to the Greeks and the Phoenicians and the concept of thessalocracy, that most of your power is derived from sea power. And that certainly is the case for the Americans post Mahanian, the influence of sea power upon nations and his great documented history. I mean, we even talk about coastal elites, where much of our power does emerge from access to markets for export, whether it's the East Coast, West Coast, or of course the Panama Canal. And it reminds me of what sort of Gary Moore had written in regards to how geography plays a role in other countries and losing access to important areas of the sea. He had written about Mexico being this like historically unfailed state. While still being failed, it had lost quite a bit of its land mass due to, of course, Western American expansion. And in doing so, that has played a huge role in their ability to export and play a role in the world power. But yeah, I mean, the United States, its Navy plays a principal role. I mean, it has the world's largest carrier fleet and maintains a lot of order in regards to global trade and anti-piracy, as well as helping to maintain international shipping. But the same thing that also comes into my mind, since we're talking about sea power, is that, and we had that map up earlier about how sort of Russia views things, and I was wondering if we could pull that up, because it's sort of going to play a big role in what we can discuss, because Russia's geopolitical lens and how they view their areas of geography, I mean, there's still the aspect of the steppe and where places that their territorial sovereignty could be violated. One of the areas that is often neglected in being mentioned is the Arctic. And that is the one area in which Russia has spent the last 20 years significantly investing in. They're the only ones that have nuclear-powered icebreakers. And that's an area that the United States is aware that they're falling behind in. But all of these avenues for how Russia views things geopolitically, we're still viewing it in a very 19th century and 20th century lens about both what Speakman and Sir Halford Mackinder had written about with the Heartland and the Rimland and the World Island.
Martin, do you have that map of Russia's perspective of its own security situation with the points of ingress, through places like the Trans-European Plain and stuff? There we are. Thank you. Okay,
Yeah, here
does
it
that
is.
help? Huh.
Yeah, I also agree with the prudentialist. Like, I think the whole heartland theory is very outdated. So I completely agree with you on that.
But yeah, I mean, this is an important way to sort of view Russia's geopolitical situation. I mean, you have the historical role. And I mean, think about in the last 2 years, the things since I've been around, what are some of the things that Semyagog and I have covered? I mean, we've talked about Kazakhstan. We've talked about the importance of the Black Sea, as well as all of these areas of ingress that could potentially be used to get involved or to create disruptions. I mean, Syria is a big important aspect of this because it's an outside warm water port. I think it's the port of Tartus that they have access to in Syria, which is another big reason why they played into there. And Russia's going to view it within those lenses. And I mean, in regards to, say, energy or access to the sea further on into the Mediterranean and getting out into the Atlantic Ocean, I mean, you have the Black Sea being crucially important. And what has the Atlantic Council been writing about for several years? Well, they have been writing about, for instance, that the Black Sea can be an area of great for energy conflict and energy production, because there's quite a bit of natural gas built underneath there. And which is the one country that is also a NATO ally that has significant control on the ingress into the Black Sea? Well, it happens to be Turkey, which utilized and invoked the Montreux Convention of 1936 to keep Western navies out. And leaving the Black Sea to sort of be relatively free of other European powers and American ships. But yeah, I mean, we have to consider the geography of how Russia views themselves. And I think that the maps and the images that Martin has on here are really important for us to consider their perspective.
I think it's especially important if you look how close Moscow basically is to Western Europe. And I brought up this image. I think it's very interesting it's a propaganda image from the Soviet Union. And well, I don't know, like maybe it's even Western. And here you see Europe from Moscow. And here you see Moscow, Europe, the great plains, and you see that's Kiev, that's Kharkov. Here's the front line here in this area, It's very close to Moscow, and it's basically completely indefensible. And if you go back to this other image, so these blue gaps are the gaps that Russia needs to fill with troops. And we've seen that the Russians did this in this area and other areas, basically have troops there. There were conflicts that were also in a way created by them. But this gap is far from being secured by Russia. Here, this area, if this area here is manned by a force that's an enemy to Russia, and you can turn a cold conflict hot, you have basically a dagger in the belly of the whole Russian Empire, where you could easily, in any situation, if you just want, force the Russians to withdraw all the troops from international conflicts and basically, as they do right now, fight a conflict there. So a strategic autonomy for Russia becoming a regional hegemon and being able to also secure trade routes, to also patrol the oceans, to have deals with Syria and become a global player again, is of course impossible when Ukraine in a way isn't controlled by Russia. So I think that's basically what this conflict is about. That's just my interpretation.
Yes, well, it certainly seems as though they want to be able to gain access to areas that you could call the soft underbelly of Russia. The whole aspect with Ukraine is very, very interesting insofar as from an operational perspective, once you cross the Dnieper River. As a friend of mine who has a military background as a staff officer, I shouldn't say friend, but someone I'm acquainted with online. He has a military background as a staff officer, and he has shown quite clearly with maps how once you cross the Dnieper, you can move divisions quite easily across the terrain up and through Russia until you hit the Moscow Ring Road. And it's worth considering that the business, as I've mentioned many times before, that the business with South Ossetia, that's that whole first sort of move to push this Promethean doctrine. Um, it involved the basically there's a Transcaucasian highway and there's Yermolov's old Georgian military highway, and the Georgian military highway is the older one. It was one of the year-round routes that you could get through the Caucasus, which is like a sort of southern defense wall for Russia or for Fortress Russia. And now the Transcaucasian highway comes out with South Ossetia. So the attempt to move in there and take that area by the Georgians, doubtless on behalf more broadly of the Western powers behind them in that action, was to seize a point of access through the southern Caucasus. And now we see them doing it with Ukraine. And as Prude is well aware, because we've talked about it in the past, they just went through this business in Kazakhstan, likely, though not certainly, with the support of the Turks. And then what is it, the Suwalski Gap or whatever? They've just been sort of poking at that in different positions. So wherever you look, we can see that there's just been this constant attempt to push further inwards towards Russia. You know, what gets talked about in the West, and again, this isn't to defend Russia, so to speak. It's to understand the motivations of the different parties on the game board. You know, in the West, we talk all the time about how, or you know, some people do, about how in '91 there were guarantees given that, you know, or '90 or whenever it was, that NATO wouldn't expand further eastward, and yet it did. That's something that people think about, but they don't look at what happened in South Ossetia in 2008. They don't look at that as being connected. They don't look at the business in Kazakhstan as being connected. And there are other examples worth mentioning as well. You know, Russia has a considerable role that it plays in Armenia, and now the West and Turkey operating together have put, you know, all sorts of effort and energy through Azerbaijan to chisel out parts of Armenia, essentially because they want to get that whole corridor going for pipelines, and they want to do it below or just outside the reach of Russia, and they want to push Russia far enough back that energy supplies across that route can't be affected. They've likewise done or arguably are doing similar things with the Black Sea. And I am convinced to this day that people are simply holding off on discussing what insiders already know, which is that the Black Sea is packed with energy resources. Yeah. Because as I've said before, Turkey was getting very belligerent about the idea of East Mediterranean pipelines, you know, Israel and Egypt and the rest crossing over to Cyprus and Crete, and then up into Greece and then through to Italy. And Turkey was woof, 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 and was like, you know, sort of aggressively pushing against prospecting in that area and talking about, you know, they're going to get together with Libya, lol, and decide that a whole half of the Eastern Mediterranean is their territorial water, and then suddenly they just shut up. They just shut up. They don't talk about it anymore, and the East Med pipeline stuff is gone. And now it seems like Turkey is waiting very, very carefully to see what's going to happen with the Black Sea. That's one last thing to throw in, so I don't just run on endlessly, and that is that we really could see a major shift in Turkey's alignment if Russia comes out of this successfully, because then it's a very straightforward proposition. Russia comes to Turkey and says, look, we'll deal you in to the Black Sea energy development aspect, but in order for that to happen, you know, you can't be a NATO player anymore. And,
I mentioned Turkey earlier for this reason, because Turkey's in NATO, but they're not like a US client state like other parts of NATO are. They're very much playing their own game that usually goes in NATO's direction, but they're very obviously playing it really cool in this war, because if Russia comes out on top here and the Russian Navy is operating in the Black Sea, you know, that could be a problem for Turkey, and Turkey could get more out of it directly if Russia cuts them a better deal on Black Sea oil access than NATO is willing to do. So I think Turkey is really, really important, even though it operates a little bit more clandestinely Well, I suppose it doesn't for the people in Armenia, but from our perspective, it's not really something we notice. But it's very important to pay attention where they are leaning.
And we have to factor in the idea that if this Prometheanism, 3Cs initiative, whatever you want to call it, type power block does get opened up, cutting off, basically standing between Western Europe and Russia, then the whole sort of framework of a possibility of EU integration and the rest is likely to shift. And that raises certain questions about, when you shake everything out, where is Turkey going to fall within that arrangement as well?
I completely agree. I think Turkey will become a major power. I also tried to bring up the maps on the screen about the areas you were talking about. And yeah, I think it's great.
That was helpful. Thank you.
Now, all the detailed knowledge you have about these areas, I think it's very, very, very important to have an eye on Turkey. I think Turkey has a very good demography. Geographically, it's a very key point, like everything that comes from the Caspian Sea, but also like for the Middle East, it will be basically the center of stability. But I think there's still a problem that's not resolved. It's between Turkey and Greece. It's a conflict that could become hot at any moment. Both are NATO members. So I think it would be very hard to find a solution there that doesn't totally pisses off Turkey or Greece.
If I could chime in on a few things, like the Turkey and Greece thing, since roughly 2014, Turkey has reshifted its view of what to do in the Aegean, sort of this blue homeland style strategy of trying to have its own sort of irredental naval claims in the islands in here, which is also, they've raised significant concerns that there are islands based upon previous treaties in the 20th century between Turkey and Greece about them being demilitarized, that there are now Greek naval equipment and armaments on a few of those islands, which Furious Pertinax and I covered on my channel. And at the same time, Turkey enjoys a relatively cozy relationship with the Germans with regards to their military technology. They've purchased
long historical relationship.
Long history, yes.
Military and intelligence, yeah.
And so you have Turkey enjoying recently purchasing German military equipment for their navy, while at the same time, in a response to France getting shafted by the AUKUS agreement since Biden took office, France had engaged in a deal to sell Rafale fighter aircraft to the Greeks alongside French naval submarines and frigates, which has only deepened their relationship as France wishes to expand its military budget. So that area has the potentiality to go hot, as Martin said. But additionally, we also have to consider that what was recently canceled, but withdrew U.S. support last year. It was the East Med pipeline between the nations of Greece, Cyprus, and Israel. It's sort of this convenient way to bypass Turkey, which the Americans had withdrew their support from, which had met some response from Greek Republicans here in the United States about the reversal of this project could only deepen dependency on Russian natural gas to Europe, when I think really the real reason why was in part due to how this could impact Turkey and their own natural gas and energy resources, because again, Turkey is going to be a major power player. They have always been seen by the United States as sort of the NATO ally, but allows them to have a foot in the door into greater Middle Eastern politics, which has significantly deteriorated since 2015. But the other thing that I also wanted to bring up was just how important the energy is going to be in the Black Sea, because we don't have detailed estimates. We do have a few, and this comes from the Atlantic Council. So again, these guys have been writing about this for some time. This is from March of 2021. They said the exact volumes of gas currently lying deep underneath the Black Sea is not yet known. Rough estimates predict that the Ukrainian shelf may contain more than 2 trillion cubic meters of gas. The exact figure is yet to be determined, since 2/3 of the country's maritime area has been passed to de facto Russian control since 2014, with Crimea being taken. And at the same time, Turkey has made international headlines in 2020 when it said its reserves at the offshore Tuna 1 exploration zone may be as high as 405 billion cubic meters, and more could be discovered in adjacent blocks. And this doesn't even begin to consider what Georgia has said, which may have recoverable gas resources of 266 billion cubic meters. Although how much of this reserves lie in the Black Sea economic zone is yet to be determined. So, I mean, this is going to be a huge area that Turkey can play a role in with any sort of future negotiations for energy pipelines and exploration with Russia.
Right. And if Russia is not in a position, as it already is fairly well with Sevastopol, the port, and everybody should remember, I know everybody here does, but everybody listening should remember that, I mean, this isn't the first time we've done this dance. The first time was the Crimean War. And it involved the same sorts of things with the Caucasus, people like Bell and others, English adventurers who traveled through the Caucasus and tried to raise awareness back home of the tribes there. And they're very interesting. I study them. But now I've noticed, like on Twitter, Circassians coming in and saying things like, we don't need to bother with, just trying to preserve our traditions anymore. We need political action. We need to, take effective action. So you can see what to me appear like, U.S. State Department and intelligence services shills right now trying to agitate the Circassians and other North Caucasian groups within Russia's realm under this Promethean strategy to start becoming a problem. We saw this in 1854, I believe it was. So we're seeing it again. Anyway, the point is that Russia has Sevastopol. It has the Crimean Peninsula, which gives it a dominant position, but it has to face the Turkish Navy. If they can come to some arrangement with Turkey, then very neatly, Turkey and Russia will control the Black Sea like their lake, even though Romania is basically the seat of the Black Sea Command for NATO powers. They can be neatly pushed back. And if Russia can take Odessa and connect with Transnistria, as I said, then they've got that much more of the coastline. They can, Ukraine can kiss any kind of claims to these resources goodbye, and Russia will have access to the Danube, which becomes very, very important for one route for getting things, energy out of that area. Last point is that if Russia doesn't, then all of these energy resources in the Black Sea become a way for Europe to get a significant amount of energy without Russia being able to say a thing about it. One of the easiest ways for them to do so. Again, the Danube isn't far away.
Yeah. You go ahead.
I think it's very important also to stress here one theory about the Euromaidan and then also about the Russian intervention. That this was, I think, it was about 2012 when they discovered these energy resources in the Donbass, but also in the Black Sea. And then there were this whole process of integration of Ukraine to Europe. This speed up process was also started, and a lot of people, I think, saw Ukraine as a shortcut, as a cheaper and more controllable gas station that basically makes it unnecessary to import from Russia. And Russia obviously also made a lot of offered a lot of good deals. And then was the question if Russia would control these resources or European oil companies. And I think that also the intervention of Russia after the Euromaidan basically thwarted the decision of the Ukrainian then president to stick with Russia for a very, very good offer that he got. Like Russia basically gave him an offer, no strings attached, almost as much money as the European Union, while they wanted to have a financial overview, a European integration process. And I'm sure Russia bribed off also a lot of those people in the old administration. Then European Union starts the Euromaidan, makes a color revolution, and then Russia intervenes. And since they discovered that, since they had the first plans to basically drill there and to get the resources out, this is a military conflict zone where Russia and Ukraine, the West and Russia, basically controlling the area, and where you cannot make any cannot get the resources out of the ground. So I think it's also was very important for Russia, because they would have lost a big share of the European market if they would have just let Ukraine become westbound and get all these resources out.
This conversation on the Black Sea is one of those important aspects. In a lot of ways, this war we see going on is very much an oil war. And Bulgaria's role in this is important as well, because Bulgaria, unlike Romania, I think is very set on the West, and Romania is playing a significant part in the Three Seas initiative, but Bulgaria is not. Bulgaria actually has an open exception that lasts until the end of 2024, which is quite a while from now, to continue importing Russian petroleum products and oil. So that's really significant. And it's also telling that Bulgaria can still go either way for Russia. If I don't think this is particularly likely, but it could happen. If Russia was successful in claiming Odessa and completely cutting off Ukraine from the Black Sea, that could potentially put the potential alliance with Turkey over splitting up this oil, like basically in the bag for Russia, because at that point, NATO would have very little leverage in the region. If they don't, however, if Russia, quote unquote, wins the war but remains east of the Dnieper, things are still going to be up in the air, and the politics of this region will be very, very interesting, because things could go either way at that point still for Turkey. But I think Turkey's clearly still hedging its bets in what's going on here, and Bulgaria is important here too.
Bulgaria is very important. They have Danube access as well, much more than the tiny little bit that Moldova has. Also, Bulgaria has stronger historical ties with Russia, much stronger. It has a strong proportion of its population. I don't know if it's a majority, but of course, in the West they say that it's a tiny minority, but I believe it's probably a slight majority in Bulgaria is pretty strongly pro-Russian. Anybody from Bulgaria, who can correct that one way or another, I'd be happy to be corrected if I'm wrong. But there is no question that in addition to things like what you're talking about, Charlemagne, with the exception for Russian energy, they also had a very, very pro-Western government that not long back, a few months back, 6 months maybe, I can't remember, just completely got knocked out of power. And the previous sort of more pro-Russian guy came back into power kind of quietly by pulling strings and doing things with his connections. And now they don't have a big pro-Western leader. So Bulgaria is a place I don't see Russia letting go of Bulgaria unless they're absolutely forced to. And this leaves out of the discussion again Serbia, which is
I was about to say that
continuing question. Yeah,
because Bulgaria, of course, connects Russia to Serbia, which they're having serious problems with right now. And if this is obviously Russia would have to do very, very well for this to happen, which is why I say it's probably not. It's not the most likely outcome. But if Russia did succeed in peeling away Moldova and Bulgaria from the West, in addition to with their partnership with Serbia, that would go a long way toward isolating Romania as well. So Bulgaria is really, really important in this equation as well.
Because Hungary is already more or less, well, very neutral about it and would work with Russia if they have to. Certainly, Serbia, they're trying to say that they've turned their face away from Russia, but they don't seem to have. And of course, I just want to add, if we get any spurgs in the chat saying, Russia will never take Bulgaria, we're not talking about boots on the ground of Russians in Bulgaria or even really in Moldova. We're just talking about basically flipping the allegiance of the elite there, which, again, I'm also not saying it's the most likely outcome, but it is one of the possibilities that we should consider. And if I had to bet, I'm not a betting man, but if I had to bet, Russian intelligence services are crazy active in places like Bulgaria right now. And Moldova. Moldova continues to cry out for how they want more Western support because Russia's destabilizing everything. As soon as this stuff really got going with Ukraine, they immediately fast-tracked places like Moldova for EU accession. So the West is very aware of this, and if anyone wants to look into it, all you have to do is just go and look at the latest news from Moldova and Bulgaria and the rest. Even if you're not a native speaker, if you just search for it in English, there's sufficient material to show you that this way of looking at the situation is not crazy.
Absolutely true. I have a friend in Serbia. I'll be visiting Belgrade in March to give a presentation there. They have a little cultural institute there, and there's really a battle going on. There were also demonstrations after Vucic basically sided with the Ukrainians in terms of the Russian occupied territories. But I think it's also very important that Serbia has a bit of a problem here, because if Serbia acknowledges these referendums, then they will have a bit of a problem with Kosovo. So I think that's also a very important detail to look at. So
yeah, and they are having some problems with Kosovo, or at least some are being created apparently over this business. You probably know more, Martin, but this business of license plates, and registering. But I'll just throw this in, and then please let me know what you know about it, since you know people there. I just saw in the last few days that there was some sort of offer made, I think through NATO, to Vucic, basically, that said, look, we may really be willing to consider some, further plans for autonomy for Serbs in Kosovo if you will go ahead and just, completely kick Russia to the curb and get with the program. But I did not hear about how that was taken or what the response was there.
Yeah, the problem is, I think, with like the Serbians, obviously just have not forgotten who bombed them, and you still see the piles of rubble laying around, sometimes even left there as a like a monument to remember. But
who sent paratroopers into Belgrade to protect them?
Exactly. Yeah, that's that's what they remember. But I think the Balkans, all of these countries are so completely and fully dependent on Western money that in the end, just like Hungary, unfortunately, I really like Hungary. I like Orban as a politician, but also Italy. If you shut off the money, then you can just create a very organic uprising against any sitting president politician. So to be honest, I think even maybe against the will of the majority of the Serbian population, they will in the end do what those people tell them to give them money. And also demographically, I don't know if the Balkans could really survive a new war. I mean, that's just my estimation. It's also very hard in these terms, but I don't see really a hot conflict arising again in the Balkans between Serbia and its neighbors. That's my
it's a good point, because they know what actually happens with it. They don't have any illusions about it because it's living memory. Also, Kosovo is hosts, if I remember correctly, a huge U.S. military base. So
exactly. Maybe again to these maps, because I think it's very interesting, and what you also said, understanding the geopolitical goals of a country doesn't mean siding with them. I think you made an amazing job in the last video to completely understand the view and the idea of Poland and its geopolitical aims, which are completely understandable from their perspective. And the Russian ones, you also mentioned this, but I just have a few interesting maps, because you see this line, the Rostov-on-Don and Leningrad line, which is the red line. If Russia cannot hold this, then their steps are completely open. And here you see the best security position Russia ever had, with a huge buffer zone with all these countries in between, Poland, the whole Warsaw Pact states. This was 1942, and this was the farthest German advance crossing this line. A real problematic situation. This was the Russian Empire. And if you look at the situation today with Russia and Ukraine, and you see this line, so Russia is not in the best situation, especially if you look at the Russian agricultural areas and also where the whole Russian civilization is. This space is basically empty land, and with an armed Ukraine, which is not friendly of Russia, Russia really has a big geopolitical problem. And obviously, what you also said, their goal is always to move the Russian sphere of influence as closely here as possible, because this area is more easily control of the Northern European plain than this area. This area is impossible to defend. They can only withdraw into their own land. So I think that's the very old Russian geopolitical goal. Also, very interesting map here. You see how the Russian Empire was created, the territorial expanse of Russia since the 1300s to 1945. And you can see that the Russian geopolitical security strategy was also expanding in the plains until they find a mountain, a sea, or something they can defend, because otherwise, also from their experience with the Mongolian hordes, their plains are completely indefensible and the civilization is destroyed again and again.
Yeah, I like these maps you're showing as well in regard to the German army, because I wanted to bring that up. If you consider how quickly the barely mechanized German army advanced all the way through these plains in a mere 6 months in 1941, and then you consider modern equipment in Ukraine, it helps you think about how utterly indefensible these plains are.
Absolutely.
And I would add, that's what I wanted to ask, if you could pull that map up. What did you call that line that's drawn there?
The Rostov-on-Don Leningrad line.
I love this because you also like these lines. I found a line of my own. And I've never heard anybody discuss it before. But if you look right there at the edge of Romania, right near where Romania, Moldova, I guess this is an old map. Yeah, this is when Romania included Moldova. But basically, if you look right there in that the furthest north little point of that space between the coast of Romania and the edge of the Crimean Peninsula, right there is where the Dniester River is. And that's where Transnistria is. Now, if you zoom back out again on this same map, so that we can see the the Baltic as well, you will see that the narrowest point, I call it the waist of Europe, it runs from right there, oddly enough, where the Russians have left their men since 1991. You draw a line straight from there to Kaliningrad, and that's the narrowest waist of Europe.
True.
So I believe that's the front line. And so they've placed as a preliminary thing so that they have a beachhead, so to speak. They kept Kaliningrad and Transnistria because those 2 points they could move centrally together and get their front defense line. So that red line you mentioned, Martin, I believe is their like last red line. I believe the one from Kaliningrad, right, is their first one. So if we want to understand where Russia wants to be in order to have sort of its minimum ability to relax from their perspective, I'm not necessarily endorsing it. I believe it runs there from Transnistria to Kaliningrad.
Agree. What I think is also an important issue to talk about is like the realism of this Prometheanism strategy, because a united Europe, a Europe of nations, it's a very beautiful idea. But the question is, can Europe really become a power and be united without having a very strong central player? Because if you look at Germany, when it was consisted of many little states, it was just a playground of different empires, like the French, the English, and even the Russians. And Italy, the same fate. Italy, as a part of little small states, always controlled by different powers and always invaded by the Austrians, by the Holy Roman Empire, by the French. And I think that the strategy of Prometheanism, and I think like from the Polish perspective, it's an alternative to imperialism from the Russians, maybe also from the Ottomans and the Germans, and also maybe an ethno-pluralistic ideal, you know, where all these nations can keep their identity, and the Poles would be maybe the primus inter pares because they have this idea and they're basically like a shepherd of these little nations. But the question is this a realistic strategy, or is it just a nice and beautiful dream?
Well, speaking of ethno-pluralism, we had mentioned Bulgaria earlier, and now that we have this sort of waistline of Europe, one of the things that had emerged out of the, sort of the rising action in 2014 with Crimea, Russia, and Ukraine was the formal organization of what we call the Bucharest Nine, or the B9 format, with those Russians, with those NATO states that were, former Soviet republics or Soviet-led Warsaw Pact states, which include Bulgaria, the Czech Republic, Estonia, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, and Slovakia, and was, led by President Duda of Poland yet again, and had led on with the Romanian president at the time. And they've been continuing when communication with the United States. They had a B9 video conference in 2 years ago in May of 2021, where they had discussed the important relationship that the United States has in terms of these Eastern European NATO states being a bigger allied presence of the NATO bloc, following at the time Russia's mobilization of troops near the border. And since the war had started, and they Jens Stoltenberg, the General Secretary of NATO, has met with both the President of the Czech Republic and Slovakia and has discussed the importance of what B9 will be in the future of relationship to the West and NATO writ large. And it's kind of funny that we're talking about Prometheanism, and you mentioned ethno-pluralism, because Prometheanism sort of was selected or became sort of the I guess political formula, or I guess the idea that was selected over more of a ethno-nationalist perspective of, say, Roman Dmowski's view of a more ethnically homogenous Polish-speaking Poland sort of empire, rather than a more multi-ethnic reminiscent of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And I still see today that we're having this sort of historical ethno-pluralism, that each of these nations have some kind of animus either towards Germany or towards Russia.
If you could bring up the Russia's desired borders map again, that would be useful for a point I wanted to make about the multipolar world.
Of course.
In truth, the unipolar world is a fantasy, which is kind of what makes it so dangerous. It's a fantasy the U.S. is to some extent living in. I mean, there never really was a unipolar world. It's always been multipolar. The question is, what are the relative security statuses and power levels of these other powers? The thing is, the reason I view the path to peace is not to push these borders to the limit. I mean, we can see that play out right now. Russia is very, very uncomfortable in the current situation with war on their very doorstep. Now, of course, there always has to be a give and take between these multipolar powers, the great powers. The border can't be in the middle of Poland like we see on this map either. But it can't be all the way pushed to the east, as the West is trying to do now, say for Belarus. There just has to be some sort of give and take here. And if the great powers of the world feel reasonably secure in their position, my view is that a more peaceful world is a more likely outcome. Whereas where the U.S. is pushing it now, it literally leads to war, as we can see. So that's my view on why the multipolar world is more likely to result in peace, because you can't push great powers like this up against the wall, especially given their recent history, and not expect them to respond.
Absolutely.
You
Absolutely, I
mentioned,
agree.
Martin mentioned realism earlier, and your discussion about multipolarity, Charlemagne, is the same kind of thing that you had American realist scholars articulate against unipolarity. Most famously, the late Kenneth Waltz, whose theory of international politics has been sort of the basis for neo-realism or structural realism in the 20th and 21st century, outside of John J. Mearsheimer. He argued that at the time, you had a state of relative peace for nations to choose between in terms of world systems, either sort of the USSR or the United States, and that even non-aligned countries had still managed to enjoy relations with one or the other more frequently, or to levy for their own leverage for, economic or incentives, investment benefits, and so on. And that he had said, once you push yourself away from that in sort of the post-fall of the Soviet Union, because he died in 2013, his big concern was going to be that unipolarity can significantly cause disruptions in world peace or developing countries, because nations inevitably want to seek hegemony, and this can cause conflict. And that, that a lot of that logic has been used to apply an argument for multipolarity, that it can create a more stable, robust balance of power on a global scale. But again, we're sort of seeing that clash of civilizations take place here, and it's not pretty.
Yeah, I would. I know that we have guests don't have a lot of time left, so please do respond to this. But then, anyone who wants to add further thoughts to this, I certainly don't want to cut it off. But I do want to see if once we do that, if we could turn to kind of a closing question. I want to hear from everybody on it, but I'm particularly interested to hear what Martin has to say about this, and that is the question of how the West, NATO, the United States, Atlanticist powers are perfectly happy to manipulate nationalist sentiment, particularly in these Three Seas initiative countries, if you will, in order to serve their own ends. The whole thing that started this discussion for me was when I was just, mucking about on Twitter, and I was like, wait a minute. This whole Three Seas initiative thing seems to be all about blocking Russian access to Three Seas. And then I was like, wait a minute, hold on. I was sharing the Poland Stronk memes back in the day. And I was, doing discussions of Poland where I'd put, winged hussars on the thumbnails. And I was like, hell yeah, man. And yet it seems absolutely incontestable that let's just say, Atlanticist powers are perfectly willing to manipulate nationalism for their own ends, particularly, for example, when it's part of a Promethean strategy to get the westernmost Slavs to kill the ones further to the east. And so I want to make sure that we covered that because as an activist and journalist, Martin sort of has a boots on the ground understanding, not to overemphasize a military metaphor. You understand me when I'm talking about peaceful, civil, and lawful action. However, Martin does have a sense of what's going on in Europe and nationalist movements. So I'd be very interested to hear about that after you guys add anything to this last bit, if there was anything further you wanted to say.
I just wanted to add, I completely agree that a multipolar world would be a more peaceful world. And by creating world peace, people are creating the biggest and greatest wars. But it depends on how you define it. But I think we're far away from multipolarity, because multipolarity, in my definition, means that there are two or more poles, like powers, who are like at least somewhat on the same level militarily and economically. At the moment, if you look at America and then at the two powers who could maybe compete with them, China and Russia, and you see both of them are completely hemmed in and in a way very, very vulnerable. And then you have America, which in my I always use a metaphor to understand America. America is a spaceship hovering over planet Earth. It's completely inattackable. It has these two oceans. In the north, it has the Canadian tundra, in the south, the Mexican desert. It has the whole Monroe Doctrine secured huge Southern American hemisphere. It has the best navy. It will stay the best navy for the next decades. And I don't see any power that comes even close to be an equal to America. And since there are no poles who are on the same level, military and economically, I would say we are far away from multipolar world, which doesn't mean obviously that America controls everything, but it's enough for America. Also, Mersheimer puts it with the aggressive realism to prevent any other regional hegemon from coming forth. And if one country becomes too strong, just create a conflict on its border to contain it. So I would agree. I would also prefer a multipolar world, but I think that unfortunately we're quite far from it. And to this question, I think it's very interesting if you see how Carl Schmitt reacted in his writings to the idea of the self-determination of nations. Because after the First World War, it was this whole idea of America, a self-determination of nations. And he really destroyed it and said, okay, that's basically, first of all, it's very individualistic and naive and not realistic geopolitically. And also it will always be used as a weapon by the thalassocracy, because they will decide which nation has the right for self-determination. The nations in the southern hemisphere of America, they don't have the right, The Basque nation, nobody cares about them. Ireland, they also don't care about them. But they pick and choose Ukraine, Taiwan, and defend their right for self-determination. And there is no universal right for self-determination. And just as Carl Schmitt said, he who says humanity wants to betray, we have to say he who says self-determination for all nations, and that's the ideal, also has to betray, because this Garden Eden, like a global zoo where every nation has their own identity and autonomy, it's a nice dream, but it's a pipe dream. And in the end, it's the question, who has the power to preserve his identity, to defend his identity? And I think nationalists and identitarians, patriots should not live in this pipe dream, should understand the geopolitical realities, and should understand that the Five Eyes and the islands around the continental powers very often use nationalists, well-meaning nationalists, very based, amazing countries who are completely understandable in the struggle for survival, from Poland to Ukraine, to further their goals and to stir up conflicts, which in the end, and that's my very strong belief, will damage all European nations. So that's basically also a bit of my ending statement.
I love the expression global zoo. I've never heard that before, but it's very striking, and I think it's a powerful image that
And
shows what sort of,
it needs a zookeeper, the zoo, obviously.
Indeed it does, and neat little bars between the sections, and as I've learned from friends in prison is all about clocks and locks, and that's where you start to understand people like Tony Blair pushing so hard for digital ID and digital infrastructure, and it's just inevitable because clocks, because locks, except on a global scale. So yeah, I think it's really important to emphasize, that when you see nationalism, these organizations, these powers are cunning enough to understand and happily exploit nationalism. When I look at that block, the 3 Seas Initiative area, you see not much migration. You really pump and push the idea of nationalism there because that's where you want them to sign up and die under a flag. And I certainly agree with what Martin's saying, that the attitudes, Frody, another guy, stuff I like very much. He's always talking about the nationalism in these regions. He visits the people, he's talked to them, he understands their motivations. So nothing about what I'm saying here is some suggestion that Lithuania doesn't deserve to exist, or beautiful Tallinn should again be under control of Russians, or that there's no legitimate motivation for Ukraine to be fighting. I'm not saying anything of the sort. The main message I want to push as my closing statement, I suppose, before handing it over to Prude and Charlemagne, is that we have to understand that simply seeing that nationalist policies are being promoted in certain places doesn't mean that good people are promoting them, nor does it mean that they're being promoted for good ends.
Okay. Should we close now? I hate to make that a false ending, but I did want to mention really quick the Baltic states, which we have.
No. We don't need to close, Charlemagne. This is turning it over to you and Prude to have some time to make your own remarks. So yeah, please.
Excellent. Well, I do want to point out the Baltic states on this map here, because we don't really talk about these states anymore, especially given the context of Ukraine. But I mean, if you look at this map, we can clearly see how the Baltics are just as critical as this Donbass area and the Crimea. And we shouldn't forget that Joseph Stalin annexed the Baltic states, right? The Baltics were a matter of serious controversy in 1991 when the Soviet Union fell apart and almost sparked a war because they unilaterally seceded. But the thing is, these states were annexed into Russia, unlike the Warsaw Pact states, which that sort of tells us what Russia's perspective on their security necessities are, right? So that's not to say that to make Russia happy, these states should be like ceded into Russia, right? But these states being in NATO and Russia not being comfortable, given the pressures being placed on it, could end up making things go very sour for these states. And of course, the Baltic Sea is part of this 3 Seas initiative, and it's all basically already pushed to the limit here in the north, right? They're pushing it to the limit now in the south, and Russia is now pushing back at that. And we should note again, Russia has annexed these places in the south, in the Donbass, Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk, right? And they might even annex Kharkov too. Who knows? So that sort of gives you a hint at the level of importance Russia places on the necessity of security guarantees in these regions. And again, we no one thinks about the Baltics anymore, but Russia sure thinks about the Baltics because, to us, they're just these 3 random small states. But to Russia, it's where NATO has already pushed its borders to the absolute limit that Russia can tolerate at all. So it's important to keep that sea in mind as well, and not just the Black Sea and the Aegean.
Yeah, I would throw in one last little bit there. there's a great irony here, which is that the simple act of officially on paper, explicitly bringing Finland in, as well as playing games with the Suwalski Gap between Kaliningrad that you can see there in the darker red, and Belarus along that little edge there, along the border with Poland as well. Basically, the fact that they have pushed so hard to destabilize and take Belarus, which happened shortly after the Ukraine Maidan stuff, but before the Ukraine war, they pushed hard to flip Belarus. And there's a clip doing the rounds on Twitter right now of Victoria Nuland talking about how they're still, doing things internally in Belarus to try to destabilize it. The irony is that if you bring Finland in, and look at this map and you'll see why, because it puts them right by St. Petersburg and closes off that whole northern coastline of that arm of the Baltic that goes into Russia. By bringing Finland in, by playing games in Belarus, they're making it more likely that Russia will from their perspective, need to do something with those Baltic states that otherwise they might have left alone for the time being, relying on Kaliningrad as sort of a rook on the chessboard. So that's something to think about. The Baltic, as Charlemagne says, is not something that we should forget about. And by forcing the issue with Finland and by playing games in Belarus and threatening to cut off the Suwalski Gap route, they're basically, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. They're like, Russia's going to invade us, parentheses, and we're doing everything possible to ensure that they're more and more likely to think they have to.
Yeah, not to mention in Finland's case, I mean, the entire Russian Navy is basically up there at their Arctic base. I forget the exact name of it, but it's very close to Finland. So Finland joining NATO constitutes an existential threat to the entire Russian Navy, basically. And then in a recent article I published on my Substack, I talked about these possibilities of Belarus entering the war, which I think would be extremely unlikely. But I think it's clear that the Americans want Belarus to enter the war because it basically means they will collapse the Belarusian state if that occurs. I don't think Belarus is going to enter the war, but yeah, Belarus figures very much into this equation as well because it's sort of, again, a thing you can easily forget about. It's like, oh, it's just an extension of Russia, but it is not in a particularly stable position under its current government either.
Prude?
Well, I'm glad that the Baltics were mentioned because I think that sometimes some of the disconnect I think that comes with American and say European commentators on geopolitical matters. This is a sense of history or potentially ethnic animus as well. I'm glad that the Baltics were mentioned because I am reminded in the Winter War, back in 1939 to 1940 in the fight against Russia that Finland and Estonia had a defense cooperation and intelligence was shared between the two countries in this short 3-month conflict against the Soviet Union. And to me, it would just seem that if Finland and Sweden are to join NATO, that would sort of bring back those kind of tensions and memories into mind. Not to mention that, you have St. Petersburg right there, you have the island of Kronstadt, or where Kronstadt is in the island, where a lot of the naval power is that also helps resupply Kaliningrad via the Baltic Sea, which could potentially shut off access to the Russian Navy, which could essentially force their hand, which is of grave concern for escalation. But the other thing I think that's important to keep in mind is that this is what a 21st century great power conflict looks like, this war in Ukraine, the sheer violence and the abject destruction and loss of life, both civilian and military, that Russia and Ukraine had already faced substantial demographic issues prior to hand. And this war has all but sealed a lot of their demographic issues in terms of decline. And I think that regardless of wherever your moral position may be, both countries are probably going to be ripe for demographic issues regardless. And I think that that's something that is going to be important here. But everything that we've covered demonstrates that it's never a clear-cut picture. Everything from energy to outside relations to historical, ethnic, political, and territorial boundaries and concerns are going to play a role here. And that we're not going to be able to cover everything, but I think that it's important for us to understand the Russian perspective as much as well as these Western states and Central European states, from the Bucharest Nine to the 3 Seas Initiative and Prometheanism, sort of bringing back these old Polish-Lithuanian concepts into the foreground here. And I think all of this does illustrate that, nationalism is very powerful, and sometimes, our own passion for things can be used to be hoisting nations on their own petard that may be against their own interest.
Dead air.
Dead air, not good.
I agree.
Yeah.
But I also wanted to stress again, because I'm a European, that I obviously want all these cultures to stay there. And also, of course, Western Europe and Germany, France, we also would have to draw a line in the sand. And we also have our own geopolitical, geostrategic interests who are not the same as Russia. But I think there would be a balance to be found. What I don't like is the intervention of a non-spatial power, because I think this can only lead to bad things, because obviously America has very different interests in France, Germany, necessarily. And I always bring up the metaphor: if I live together with a friend, in the same house, and then somebody is basically remote controlling this guy, and this guy is my enemy, then I also wouldn't trust his friend anymore. So I think that's a big problem also for Russia, because they are dealing with remote controlled countries who are doing things who are completely against their interest, sometimes even suicidal, because they are not really acting rational. And I think that's a big problem. If you think this metaphor is fit in a way, so first of all, we would need to become sovereign again, and then do things that are really in our interests. So I think that's my biggest criticism. It's not so much about Ukraine or pro-Russia. It's against the intervention of America in Europe.
Yeah, go ahead, Oliver. I think we're coming to a conclusion. I only wanted to bring up the Baltics. Past the 2-hour mark, it starts to get harder to form coherent thoughts.
Right, and I think Prude actually has to move on to. I think he's got another stream, but
no, I already did that one. You were my last bit for today.
Oh, well, also, I want to just thank you, Prude, by the way, for so kindly being flexible on that. I appreciate that.
Thank you. It was my fault.
So then let's roll through then. Well, Prude, did you have anything final thing you wanted to add?
No, I think my thoughts there were pretty conclusive. Is that any conflict like this is going to be multi-layered, and we have to keep that in mind. It's never going to be black and white.
Fair enough. And because of dialectical manipulations, they always want you to make it seem as make you feel as though it's black and white. Okay, well then, gents, let's roll through. Maybe Martin, then Charlemagne, then Prude. Any final shilling or self-promotion to do, or any closing remarks on upcoming projects or things that people should look at or check out? Remember, a lot of these people have come in on the stream and weren't here for the beginning, so at least repeat what you mentioned at the opening.
I can just say thank you very much again for having me here. It was very interesting to talk to you. Again, I think what you offer here is a very important commentary on a very, very high level and high depth. I learned a lot of things, and I have a lot of things I'm going to research, names and geopolitical areas. And I hope that we can continue the conversation in the future.
Absolutely. Great pleasure to have you on, Martin. Thank you. Charlemagne?
Yeah, I am working on some content for the Old Glory Club. Check out the oldgloryclub.substack.com. And then, of course, we have a live stream tomorrow, as is our norm, our Friday live streams. And I think maybe the Prudentials could correct me. I think that's the one with Thomas77 on, along with Pete Quinones, and they're going to be talking about the Vietnam War in some capacity.
Yes, they are.
Cool. Well, I'll go ahead and hand it to you then.
Well, yeah, I will echo Charlemagne's points there. Of course, the Old Glory Club for more of an American history and political and cultural focus. Thank you again, Semigog, for having me on. I always love talking geopolitics with you. And by all means, I am on Substack, YouTube, Telegram, Odyssey, all that fun stuff that's linked down below. And hopefully we can continue these kinds of conversations, because just in 2 hours, we didn't even get to scratch more of the surface that we wanted to get into, but that shows you how in-depth these things go and the need to read what these people publish.
Absolutely. When they tell you things halfway believe them or add it to the pile of shit they might do to you, right? Okay, gents, thank you very, very much, one and all, the panel, as well as all the people who so kindly joined us and listened. Again, we're not here to argue for one side or the other. We are here to provide a neutral background that won't offend people like Susan, who runs YouTube. So yeah, thank you one and all for joining us. We'll be back. Who knows? There could even be a part 3, and I could see in future the possibility, certainly, of looking at Ukraine and what's happening here from this broader perspective. And we might get together again just to look at that, because I think we have an excellent panel here in that respect. If any of these guys have time, maybe even something like something having to do with Ukraine spring offensives or Russian offensives that might come up. So anyway, yeah, thank you one and all. That does it for this evening. Please check out the links below for all the guests. Give them your support. There's all kinds of shit that they deal with in order as a result of putting themselves out there in public. So support is always welcome. If nothing else, check out their content and share it. And yeah, until next time, I am Semiagog, and I am out.